Hello, I'm Prakash Bagri. I'm currently the Clinical Associate Professor of Marketing at the Indian School of Business in Hyderabad. For the past decade, I have also been an academic and consultant, helping multiple organizations drive their own innovation agenda. Innovating in India has proven to be a challenge for global brands. Coca-Cola tried to establish its classic Coke in India for decades, but finally had to crumble under the weight of Thumbs Up. Unilever followed the same challenges of trying to bring in walls at the expense of quality, but did not succeed. More recently, we have seen how Kellogg's, after decades of trying to establish breakfast cereals, finally decided that a healthy coexistence with staple Indian breakfast items like upma was perhaps the more effective means. While this has been happening, we have also seen a spate of foreign companies, particularly in the automobile space, exiting from the Indian market after having spent years trying to establish themselves without success. Ford, General Motors are just a few names. We have seen similar challenges faced by companies in the entertainment space, world space, MTV, etc. Why is it that innovating and establishing oneself in the Indian context becomes such a challenge? It signals the incompetence of standard innovation templates to operate in our market. This observation across the vast multitude of companies trying to innovate helps us identify some of the deep-rooted notions and shibboleths which they have used while bringing their offerings over here. India is a developing market. Unfortunately, that has got translated into meaning this is a market for cheaper products. Tata Nano was a classic example of trying to bring a cheap car. I was myself involved with Intel when we tried to launch Celeron to address market requirements like ours. Unfortunately, both these and multitude other cheap products have failed in our market. The second challenge which companies have faced is a mismatch between what they are actually selling and what gets delivered to the customer. And this mismatch happens because our delivery channels do not always exhibit the same degree of rigor or development which these companies might have dealt with. I'll give you an example of mobile phones. Now, when you're selling a mobile phone, it is expected that people will be able to charge it. Unfortunately, in the Indian market, especially in the rural areas where there was a challenge of power, Nokia had faced a major issue. Nokia succeeded because it went forward in terms of enabling the village kirana store owner with car batteries to help charge the mobile phones of the villagers. Most companies don't go the full hog, and therefore we tend to see this gap between what the consumer seeks versus what their product ends up delivering. These and a few other areas seem to suggest that it's time for us to develop an alternate view to innovating the India way. So based on the experience of these companies, what lessons can I elicit which helps us in defining the innovation the India way? Number one, Indians and the Indian market does not seek cheap products. In fact, cheap products tend to fail over here. Instead, what marketeers have to look at is how can we deliver value to consumers in the most effective manner. I'll take the example of Philips Healthcare Systems to illustrate that. Philips Healthcare makes hospital beds, and typically these hospital beds are equipped with a video monitor. The video monitor basically is used by the attendant surgeon to monitor how all the patients are basically progressing. However, when Philips decided to launch the product in the Indian market, instead of trying to bring in a cheaper version of this or give in a bed without a video monitor, what they did was they looked at it in the context of the Indian market. And they realized that over here in a hospital room, you don't really have one room and one bed. Instead, we tend to have wards where there would be 10, 20 or more beds and patients over there. And this insight allowed Philips to basically then say that whereas the bed will be without the video monitor, instead they will provide a separate unit which will be a video monitor on a trolley, and the attendant in the hospital room will be able to move the trolley across all the patients so that the presiding doctor still gets a chance to view all the patients and does not lose on that. At the same time, we are able to get maximum value out of the product instead of just bringing in the product or a cheaper version of it. These simple ideas of creating value in the most effective manner have often ended up providing the precursor for innovation which emerges from here but which can then be taken to other markets. The second area which we can look at in terms of lessons to draw from companies which have failed is the fact that waterfall models do not work any longer. Now, what I mean by waterfall models is best illustrated by the notion of the ambassador car, a model which was end of life in the United Kingdom but was adopted over here by Hindustan Motors and then became the most successful car model in India for decades. Those days are gone. In today's day and age, instead what companies have to do is figure out what is the most effective product which is being created for that market. And very often, in that case, the Indian market becomes a leading market for the product. Hollywood is a classic case in point. There were days when a Hollywood blockbuster would come to India months, oftentimes years after it was released. No longer so today. Very often we see the latest blockbuster actually being released on the same date, and in some cases a few days before it even has its worldwide launch. And the reason that happens is because Hollywood has now figured out that there's a far bigger market for these blockbusters in India as long as the movies are dubbed in specific local languages. What the dubbing basically then does is makes the product relevant and useful for a much larger audience. It helps create the market, and then suddenly India becomes a top leading market. The third part of the lesson which we can learn is the fact that this is not a market where we bring copy and paste model into play. This is perhaps best illustrated again by the case of the automobile companies which I talked about. Quite a few European automobile companies failed in the Indian market is because they used their existing models and they tried to sell it over here. Not only did they use their existing models, they also wanted to replicate the distribution systems and structures which they had used in those markets. Despite the best attempts and a lot of marketing investments, that did not work. On the other hand, there have been foreign automobile companies, and particularly the Korean ones, which have worked very well. The reason these companies worked is because they looked at the unique nature, the infrastructure, the kind of roads, the way we Indians use our cars, and then redesigned the overall car in order to address it. That's how Hyundai Santro went on to become such a blockbuster. At the end of it, Innovating the India Way reiterates some of the basic points of marketing. Providing value to consumers always works. Meeting the pain points of the customers always work. Making the product or service useful and addressing the customer need always works. And ultimately, providing an integrated delivery mechanism always works.